What would you do if you saw injustice happening right before your eyes? Would you turn away? Or would you step in, risking everything to make a difference? This is the story of Amir, a man who had it all: wealth, power, and influence, but chose to walk away from his life of luxury to expose a dark truth hidden in plain sight. In a city buzzing with life, where towering skyscrapers cast long shadows over crumbling alleyways, the gap between the rich and the poor was impossible to ignore. For the privileged, life moved fast, filled with opportunities. But for those on the streets, survival was a daily battle, with little hope for change. Amir, a self-made millionaire, had always believed in hard work and fairness. But one fateful evening, he saw something that shook him to his core: a homeless man being harassed by the very people sworn to protect him. That moment planted a seed of doubt in Amir's mind. What if this wasn't an isolated incident? What if the system meant to uphold justice was exploiting the most vulnerable instead? Determined to uncover the truth, Amir made a decision most would consider unthinkable. He would leave behind his comfortable life, disguise himself as a homeless man, and walk the streets to see the world from their eyes. Stick around, because by the end of this video, you'll not only witness Amir's incredible transformation but also learn how his daring actions brought down a web of corruption that had been hidden for years. What he discovered will shock you and might even change how you see your own community. Amir's life had always been one of convenience. A phone call could solve any problem, and a swipe of his credit card could open any door. But that evening, as he sat in his car waiting for the light to turn green, his eyes caught a scene that felt like a punch to the gut. Across the street, a homeless man, frail and weathered by life, was being shoved against a wall by two uniformed police officers. Amir rolled down his window to hear what was happening. "I told you, I don't have anything," the man pleaded, his voice trembling. The officers didn't seem to care. They rifled through his few belongings: a tattered backpack, a blanket, a dented can. When they found nothing, one officer muttered something under his breath, gave the man a hard shove, and walked away. The light turned green, but Amir couldn't move. His hands gripped the steering wheel as anger and disbelief surged through him. Was this really how the world worked? The weak bullied by those in power while the rest of society turned a blind eye. That night, Amir couldn't sleep. The image of the man's helplessness replayed in his mind, gnawing at him. For all his success, he had never felt so powerless. But then an idea began to form: a dangerous, audacious idea. What if he didn't just feel sorry for the man? What if he stepped into his shoes? Amir knew this wouldn't be a simple experiment. It would be risky, uncomfortable, and could even tarnish his reputation if things went wrong. But deep down, he felt a responsibility to do something. He needed to know the truth. Was the system as broken as it seemed? And if it was, could he do anything to fix it? That was the moment Amir's life took a turn. The spark of an idea had become a burning resolve. Little did he know, this decision would not only change his life forever but also expose a reality most people never dared to see. Amir wasn't the type to rush into things blindly. He knew that if he wanted to uncover the truth, he had to be methodical. Exposing corruption required more than outrage, it required evidence. Sitting in his sleek office surrounded by luxury, he began crafting a plan, one that would take him from the pinnacle of wealth to the harsh realities of street life. First, he needed to disappear. His tailored suits and expensive watch were the antithesis of the life he was about to enter. Over the next few days, Amir transformed himself. He traded his designer clothes for second-hand rags and let his neatly trimmed beard grow scruffy. His once pristine hands were dirtied with grease and grime. Even his posture changed. Gone was the confident stride of a millionaire, replaced by the weary shuffle of someone burdened by life's weight. Next, he prepared tools for his mission. A hidden camera, no larger than a button, was sewn into his tattered jacket. A small recorder was concealed in his pocket. These gadgets were his lifeline, his way to document the injustices he was determined to uncover. But the hardest part wasn't the disguise or the equipment, it was letting go of his identity. For weeks, Amir studied the patterns of the homeless in his city. He learned where they gathered, how they spoke, and how they survived. To truly blend in, he couldn't just look the part, he had to live it. On the day he stepped out of his mansion for the last time, he paused at the gate. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was walking away from comfort, safety, and privilege into uncertainty and danger. But this wasn't about him anymore. It was about the people whose voices had been silenced for too long. As he walked toward the city's darker corners, Amir felt the weight of his decision settle in. The life he had always known was gone, replaced by an uncharted path. He didn't know what he would find, but one thing was certain: he wasn't turning back. The first night on the streets was a rude awakening. The air was damp and cold, the concrete beneath Amir's makeshift bedding felt like stone against his back, and the distant hum of the city was punctuated by sirens and angry shouts. For the first time in his life, he was invisible, not the kind of invisibility that comes with anonymity, but the kind where people deliberately look away, pretending you don't exist. As the days passed, Amir began to blend in. He positioned himself in crowded areas where other homeless individuals gathered under bridges, in public parks, and outside bustling train stations. Slowly, he started making connections. At first, the others were wary of him. A newcomer always raised suspicion, but Amir's humility and willingness to share the little he had broke down their walls. One of his first friends was an elderly man named Rafiq, who had been on the streets for nearly a decade. "You're lucky if the cops ignore you," Rafiq said one evening, warming his hands over a small fire. "If they don't, they'll either take what little you have or beat you for fun." Another was a young woman named Sana, barely in her 20s, who had been kicked out of her home. "I've stopped reporting anything," she said bitterly. "What's the point? The police don't protect us, they hunt us." Each story Amir heard added fuel to his mission. He saw firsthand the daily humiliations the homeless endured, being chased from public spaces, denied basic services, and treated like criminals for simply existing. And yet, there was an unspoken resilience among them, a camaraderie born of shared struggle. Amir's transformation wasn't just physical, it was emotional. The hunger gnawed at him, the cold seeped into his bones, and the constant fear of being attacked or robbed weighed heavily on his mind. He began to understand what it meant to live without safety nets, to wake up every morning unsure if you'd make it through the day. But beneath the struggle, Amir found something else: a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just gathering evidence, he was learning the truth about a world he had never known. And with each passing day, his resolve grew stronger. The corruption he sought to expose wasn't just an abstract idea anymore, it was a daily reality, and he was living it. It was a gray afternoon, the kind where the clouds hung low and the air felt heavy. Amir had found a spot near a busy market, hoping to blend into the background. He sat on a piece of cardboard, his head bowed low, as countless feet shuffled past him without a glance. Suddenly, he heard a commotion. "Hey, you! What are you doing here?" a harsh voice barked. Amir looked up to see two police officers towering over a group of homeless men huddled near the corner. Their faces were stern, their hands resting casually on their batons. Amir felt a jolt of adrenaline. This was the moment he had been waiting for, but it was happening faster than he'd expected. The officers singled out a frail man with a limp. "You've been warned before," one of them said. "You can't just loiter here." "I'm not doing anything wrong," the man stammered, his voice shaking. "I'm just sitting." Before he could finish, the officer grabbed his arm and yanked him to his feet. "Don't talk back to me," the officer growled. "You got money? No? Then maybe it's time you paid in other ways." Amir's heart pounded as he discreetly activated the hidden camera in his jacket. The other officer began rummaging through the man's few belongings, scattering them onto the sidewalk. A worn blanket, a couple of coins, and a half-empty water bottle were tossed aside as if they were trash. "This is all you've got?" the officer sneered, kicking the coins into the gutter. "Pathetic." Amir clenched his fists, every instinct telling him to intervene, but he knew he couldn't blow his cover. Instead, he stayed silent, capturing every word, every movement. The scene escalated as the officers demanded the man leave the area. When he hesitated, one of them gave him a shove, causing him to stumble and fall. Laughter followed as they walked away, leaving the man to pick up his scattered belongings. Amir's chest burned with anger and helplessness. He wanted to shout, to call them out, but he knew his mission was bigger than this one moment. This was just the beginning, and he needed to keep going. As the man limped away, Amir whispered to himself, "I'll pay for this." Every single one of them. His resolve had never been stronger. He had seen enough to know the system was rotten, and he was determined to expose it for what it truly was. Over the next few days, Amir's world became a whirlwind of hidden recordings, whispered conversations, and tense encounters. Every corner of the city seemed to hold another story of abuse, another moment of corruption waiting to be uncovered. With each incident he documented, The puzzle pieces began to fall into place, painting a grim picture of a system that thrived on exploiting the powerless. One evening, Amir witnessed another shocking event. A group of homeless individuals had gathered near an abandoned lot to share a meal, a rare moment of peace in their otherwise chaotic lives. But peace was fleeting. Two officers arrived, demanding the group disperse. "You're trespassing," one officer barked, though it was clear no one owned the lot. The officers began confiscating their meager possessions: bags, blankets, even the leftover food. "Consider this your eviction notice," one of them sneered. When a young man protested, the officer slapped him across the face. Amir recorded it all, his hands trembling as he adjusted the hidden camera. He knew the evidence he was gathering was powerful, but the weight of it pressed heavily on his conscience. These weren't just statistics or news stories anymore. These were real people, living through unimaginable hardships. Late one night, Amir sat in a quiet alley, reviewing the footage he had captured so far. There were clips of officers taking bribes, threatening the homeless, and even pocketing money meant for aid programs. It was worse than he had imagined. The corruption wasn't just a few bad apples, it was systemic, deeply ingrained in the culture of those who were supposed to serve and protect. As he watched, Amir realized the enormity of his mission. This wasn't just about exposing a few corrupt cops. It was about shining a light on an entire system that had failed the most vulnerable. He began organizing the footage, creating a timeline of events that would be impossible to ignore. But the risks were growing. Amir had noticed a few officers eyeing him suspiciously during his time on the streets. One even questioned him, asking why he always seemed to be around during incidents. Amir played dumb, mumbling something about bad luck, but he knew he was walking a fine line. Despite the danger, Amir pressed on. The stories he had heard and the evidence he had gathered were too important to stop now. With every recording, he felt closer to his goal. The truth was out there, and he was determined to bring it into the light, no matter the cost. The night Amir nearly got caught was one he wouldn't forget. It was just past midnight, and the city was eerily quiet. Amir had positioned himself near a dimly lit alley, knowing it was a hotspot for late-night patrols. His hidden camera was ready, and he hoped to capture another piece of the puzzle. The sound of boots on the pavement signaled the arrival of two officers. They were laughing, their voices carrying in the stillness of the night. Amir tensed, trying to appear invisible as they approached a group of homeless men gathered near a dumpster. "What do we have here?" one officer said, his tone mocking. "You all throwing a party without an invitation." The men mumbled apologies, but the officers weren't interested in words. They began kicking over their belongings, scattering whatever little they had. One of the officers spotted an old man clutching a bag and snatched it away, rifling through it. Amir's heart raced as he discreetly recorded the scene. He was so focused on the officers that he didn't notice one of them glance in his direction. "Hey, you," the officer called out, his voice sharp. Amir froze. The officer started walking toward him, suspicion etched on his face. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I'm just sitting," Amir stammered, lowering his gaze and trying to sound defeated. "You're always around, aren't you?" the officer said, his eyes narrowing. "What's your deal?" Amir's mind raced. If they searched him, they'd find the hidden camera and everything would be over. "I've got nowhere else to go," he muttered, trying to sound as convincing as possible. "Just trying to stay out of trouble." The officer stared at him for what felt like an eternity before scoffing. "Stay out of my sight," he said, turning back to his partner. Amir let out a silent breath of relief as the officers moved on, their laughter fading into the distance. But the encounter left him shaken. He knew how close he had come to losing everything. That night, Amir sat alone, his nerves frayed. The fear was real, but so was his determination. He couldn't let a close call deter him. The stakes were too high, and the people he was fighting for had no one else. This mission was no longer just a choice, it was a responsibility. And no matter the risks, Amir vowed to see it through to the end. As Amir walked the streets that night, the close call with the officers still weighed heavily on his mind. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a mix of fear, frustration, and doubt. For the first time since he'd started this journey, he wondered if he had underestimated what it truly meant to live as one of the forgotten. Hunger gnawed at him constantly. The scraps he managed to scavenge were never enough to fill his stomach, and the cold nights left him shivering, his muscles aching by morning. The blisters on his feet from walking all day throbbed with every step. But it wasn't just the physical hardships, it was the psychological toll that hit the hardest. The looks of disgust from passers-by, the dismissive gestures, the way people crossed the street to avoid him, all of it chipped away at his sense of self. He realized how easily society erased the homeless, treating them as invisible or worse, as nuisances. For someone who had always commanded respect, this new reality was crushing. One night, as he sat under an overpass, Amir found himself staring at the city lights in the distance. He thought about his old life, the warmth of his home, the meals he had taken for granted, the simple luxury of feeling safe. It all seemed like a distant memory now. A part of him wanted to quit, to return to his life of comfort. But then he thought about Rafiq, Sana, and the countless others he had met on the streets. He thought about the injustices he had witnessed and the evidence he had gathered. This wasn't just about him anymore. He had a chance to make a real difference, to give a voice to those who had been silenced for too long. That night, Amir made a promise to himself. He would endure whatever it took, no matter how difficult, no matter how much it hurt. The fear, the hunger, the exhaustion, none of it would stop him. If anything, these experiences only deepened his resolve. For the first time, Amir understood the resilience of the homeless community. Despite their struggles, they found ways to survive, to keep going, even when the world seemed determined to push them down. It was this resilience that inspired him to push forward. By morning, Amir felt a renewed sense of purpose. The journey wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore, it was about fighting for the dignity of every person he had met. And as he stepped out into the city once more, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next. Amir's resolve was tested again just a few days later, but this time, the stakes were even higher. He had positioned himself near a public plaza, a place he knew was frequently patrolled by a pair of particularly aggressive officers. As he sat quietly, pretending to doze off, he noticed the officers approaching a small group of people huddled near a fountain. One of them was Rafiq. Amir's chest tightened as he watched his friend stand up slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of submission. "What's the problem, officer?" Rafiq asked calmly, though Amir could see the tension in his posture. "You've been warned about begging here," the officer snapped, stepping closer. "This isn't your turf." "I wasn't begging," Rafiq protested, his voice steady but firm. "I was just sitting." The officer didn't care. He grabbed Rafiq by the collar and shoved him against the fountain's edge. The sound of Rafiq's body hitting the stone made Amir flinch. The second officer laughed, clearly enjoying the display of power. Amir felt a surge of anger. He had seen enough. This wasn't just harassment, it was brutality. He discreetly activated his hidden camera, making sure every detail was captured. But as he watched, he realized something else. The officers weren't just targeting Rafiq. They were working together to intimidate the entire group, using fear to keep everyone in line. "You think you can do whatever you want," the first officer said, his face inches from Rafiq's. "We run this city, not you." Rafiq didn't respond. He simply lowered his head, his silence speaking volumes. The scene ended as abruptly as it had begun. The officers pushed Rafiq to the ground and walked away, leaving the group shaken but unharmed. Amir's heart pounded as he reviewed the footage on his recorder. This was the proof he needed, undeniable evidence of abuse, caught in the act. But the encounter also left him shaken. Rafiq, who had become a mentor and a friend, had just endured an act of cruelty that Amir couldn't stop. The helplessness gnawed at him, but it also fueled his determination. That night, Amir shared the footage with an anonymous ally he had contacted before starting his mission, a journalist known for exposing corruption. "This is just the beginning," Amir wrote in the message. "There's more to come." The response was immediate: "Keep going. The world needs to see this." Amir felt a flicker of hope. For the first time, he realized his efforts weren't in vain. The turning point wasn't just about gathering evidence, it was about finding allies, building momentum, and ensuring that the truth would finally come to light. The days following Amir's breakthrough were a whirlwind. With each passing moment, the stakes grew higher. The footage he had captured, undeniable proof of the police officers' brutality, was making its way into the hands of those who could make a difference. But as much as he felt the pressure of exposing the truth, Amir knew the danger was mounting. He couldn't shake the feeling that the officers were getting closer to discovering who he really was. Every time he walked through the city streets, he noticed them eyeing him more carefully, their gazes lingering a little too long. One evening, as he sat near a park bench pretending to sleep, he overheard two officers discussing something that sent a chill down his spine. "Did you see that guy again?" one officer asked. "The one who's always around when something happens." "I don't trust him," the other replied. "We should keep an eye on him." Amir's heart skipped a beat. He had been careful, always blending in, never drawing attention to himself. But now, it seemed like his cover was slipping. The officers were suspicious, and it wouldn't be long before they started putting the pieces together. That night, Amir decided to take a different route. He avoided the usual places where the officers had seen him, trying to keep a low profile. But even in the quieter parts of the city, he couldn't escape the constant tension that gripped him. The fear of being discovered was real, and it gnawed at him every time he made his way to a new location to capture more footage. But there was no turning back now. With each encounter he documented, with each corrupt act he witnessed, Amir grew more certain that he was on the right path. The system he was trying to expose wasn't just broken, it was rotten to its core. And he was the only one who had the power to expose it for the world to see. Despite the fear, Amir found a strange sense of clarity. The people he had met, the homeless, the outcasts, the forgotten, had become his motivation. He could no longer ignore their suffering, and he would not allow their voices to be silenced. His mission was bigger than his own safety. It was about justice. The pressure mounted, but so did Amir's resolve. He knew he couldn't back down now. With every passing day, the truth he had gathered became more explosive, and the closer he got to uncovering the full extent of the corruption, the more dangerous his mission became. But Amir had made a promise to himself and to the people he had met on the streets that he would see this through to the end. The tension was palpable, but so was the fire within him. Nothing could stop him now. Amir's final push to expose the truth came in the dead of night. His camera, now loaded with enough footage to shake the foundations of the corrupt system, was his most valuable tool. He knew that what he had collected so far was damning, but it wasn't enough. The world needed to see everything: the systemic abuse, the collusion, and the exploitation of the most vulnerable people in the city. The plan was simple: deliver the footage to the journalist who had agreed to help him, but not before ensuring that every last piece of evidence was secured. Amir knew that if the footage were to disappear, his entire mission would have been for nothing. For the past few days, he had been carefully documenting everything he could. From officers pocketing bribes from local businesses to illegal detainments of homeless individuals, the scope of the corruption was undeniable. But the real bombshell came when Amir uncovered a hidden deal between the police department and a private contractor responsible for clearing homeless encampments. The contractor paid the officers to clear the streets, often by using force or coercion, making the lives of the homeless even more unbearable. Amir's hands shook as he transferred the final files onto a secure drive. His mind raced, knowing that once the world saw this, everything would change. The lives of the officers involved, the contractor, and the corrupt officials who turned a blind eye would be under scrutiny, but so would his own life. As he made his way to the designated meeting point, Amir felt a mix of exhilaration and fear. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was the point of no return. There was no going back now. Either the truth would be exposed, or the consequences of his actions would be too great to bear. He arrived at the journalist's office just before dawn. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the city felt like it was holding its breath. As he handed over the drive containing the footage, the journalist's eyes widened. "This is bigger than I thought," she said, her voice low. "This is the kind of story that will change everything." Amir nodded. "I've seen enough. It's time for the world to know the truth." As the journalist began to review the footage, Amir stepped back, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just about exposing a few bad officers, it was about holding a broken system accountable. The power structures that allowed corruption to thrive had to be dismantled, and it had to start with this. For a moment, Amir allowed himself to breathe, to let the reality of what he had done settle in. The road ahead would be uncertain, and he knew there would be consequences. But no matter what happened next, he had made a difference. He had stood up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, and in doing so, he had exposed the truth that the city had been trying so hard to hide. The journalist's voice cut through his thoughts. "We're running this story. It's going live today." And just like that, Amir's world was about to change forever. The moment the story broke, the city was rocked. News outlets picked up the explosive footage within hours, and social media erupted. The images of police officers brutalizing the homeless, of corruption so deeply embedded in the system, sent shockwaves through the public. Protests began to erupt in the streets, demanding accountability, demanding justice for those who had been treated as less than human. For Amir, the aftermath was a whirlwind. The phone calls and messages came pouring in, from journalists, activists, and even people he didn't know, all thanking him for exposing the truth. But with the praise came a darker reality. His face was now known, his role in the expose undeniable. He had become a target. The police officers whose actions he had documented were suspended pending investigation, but Amir knew that the real fight was just beginning. The system he had exposed was powerful, and it wouldn't be dismantled easily. But for the first time in his life, Amir saw the potential for real change. The voices of the homeless, the marginalized, the voiceless, they were being heard, and that was just the beginning. The backlash came swiftly. Officers who had been involved in the misconduct tried to smear his name, calling him a liar, a troublemaker. But it was too late. The evidence was irrefutable. And as the story spread across national headlines, more whistleblowers began to come forward, emboldened by Amir's courage. As the days passed, Amir watched as the city began to shift. There were calls for reform, for better treatment of the homeless, for a more transparent and accountable police force. The movement was growing, and Amir realized that what he had started was bigger than just exposing a few corrupt cops. It was about sparking a revolution of justice for the marginalized. But the victory was bittersweet. The cost of Amir's actions was high. He had lost his anonymity, his safety, and perhaps even his peace of mind. His friends, like Rafiq and Sana, had become targets too. The streets that had once been his refuge now felt dangerous. The threat of retaliation loomed over him like a shadow, and Amir knew he had to stay vigilant. Despite everything, he felt a sense of fulfillment. He had risked it all, lived through unimaginable hardships, and exposed the truth. And in doing so, he had given a voice to those who had been silenced for far too long. As he stood at the edge of the city, looking out over the skyline, Amir couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt hope not just for himself, but for the countless others who had been forgotten. His mission had sparked a fire, and he was determined to keep fueling it. In the end, Amir realized that true change didn't come from comfort or privilege. It came from the courage to stand up, to expose the truth, no matter the cost. And he had found that courage in the most unlikely of places, among the very people society had discarded. The weeks after the expose felt like a blur. The protests, the headlines, the discussions on social media, all of it had led to a groundswell of change, but Amir couldn't afford to sit back and watch. The movement he had ignited wasn't just a moment in time. It was a fight that needed constant attention, action, and support. In the days following the story's release, Amir had received messages from across the country from people who had experienced similar abuse, from organizations dedicated to the homeless, and from those who wanted to know how they could help. The shift in public opinion was undeniable, but Amir knew it wouldn't be enough to just expose the corruption. Real change would require a sustained effort, one that demanded accountability from every level of government and law enforcement. But Amir also understood the reality of what had happened. He was no longer the man he had been before all of this. The transformation had been more than just a shift in perspective, it had altered his entire life. The luxury of anonymity was gone. Every step he took was now watched, scrutinized by those who had the power to retaliate. But it wasn't just the threat of retaliation that kept him on edge. It was the knowledge that the fight was far from over. As Amir watched the ongoing protests, the calls for police reform, and the conversations about the treatment of the homeless, he couldn't help but feel both proud and overwhelmed. He had exposed the truth, but he had also opened a door that could not be closed. The corrupt system he had unearthed wasn't just a local issue, it was part of a broader problem that existed in cities across the country. And now, more people were aware of it than ever before. Rafik, Sana, and the others he had met on the streets were no longer invisible. They were no longer forgotten. Amir had given them a voice, and that voice was powerful. But he also knew that the people he had fought for would need more than just awareness. They needed tangible change. And while the battle had been won in the court of public opinion, the real work would come in the months and years ahead. Amir didn't know what his future held. He had lost his old life, his sense of safety, and perhaps even his peace of mind. But he had gained something much more valuable, a sense of purpose. He knew he couldn't stop now. The story of the corrupt officers, the people who had suffered, and the truth that had been revealed wasn't just his. It belonged to everyone who had ever been oppressed, silenced, or ignored. He had become part of a larger movement, a force for justice that stretched beyond the city limits. Amir knew that the fight for justice would be a long one, but as long as there was a voice left to speak, as long as there were people willing to listen, the fight would continue. And as Amir walked through the streets, the city around him buzzing with new energy and new conversations, he realized that sometimes the hardest battles led to the greatest victories. The story of a rich man who had pretended to be homeless was more than just an expose. It was a testament to the power of truth, the resilience of the human spirit, and the unshakable belief that one person could change the world. For Amir, this was just the beginning. The journey was far from over, and he would continue to walk it, no matter the cost. If you believe in the power of truth, justice, and change, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories like Amir's. Your voice matters. Let's keep the conversation going. Together, we can make a difference.